Dr. Anne McKnight.
Well, I just wanted to tell you how delighted, even though I didn't put the T in the center, how delighted I am to be here to talk with you. And I would like to hear some of your thinking. I don't have very long tonight, and I want to talk to you a little bit. And I want to hear your thinking about what I present. So the structure of tonight is that I'm going to do a PowerPoint, and it is an effort to try to pull the essence out of Bowen theory and present it to you. And this could take me a year, and I have tried to put it in 45 minutes. Then I think there's going to be a little break where you can get your refreshments, and I'm going to present a videotape, which is 29 minutes, and then I'd like to have some discussion. So there's a lot to pack in. So let me just talk to you a little bit about how I got interested in Bowen theory. And this is a personal story, but I think it's kind of the journey that took me to where I am today as the director of the center. So when my son was 2 years old, I wanted to go back to work. And so I looked around for a part-time job. And a part-time job showed up at an alcohol and drug program. And I knew nothing about alcohol or drug addiction. And there was a little bit of setup when I went to that center because it was staffed by people who were recovering people who were the counselors in the center. But anyway, so I decided to sign up to work for the center. And I began, and I received my first client. And so the client was actually a husband and wife, and the wife came in and said, you know, my husband has been drinking all the time. He uses up the money for our food and rent. We have 2 little children, and I don't know what to do. I'm at my wit's end. Her husband is sitting there. So I said, well, what do you want him to do? And she says, I want him to quit drinking. And I said to the guy, I said to the husband, I said, well, what do you think about that? Your wife wants you to quit drinking. And he said, well, I think I will. And so I go, this is not as hard as they say it is. I mean, this is a true story, honestly. This was my first client. So the next week they come back, and I said, well, how are you doing? He says, I am doing great. I am going to AA. I am trying to help around the house. I am helping with our little children. I am working very hard. I am trying to help my wife. I am doing the best job I know how. And I said, well, how are you doing, to the wife? And she says, I'm kind of depressed. And I said, what do you mean? I mean, it's like, he just did what you wanted him to do. I had not had any training in family therapy. And I said, he just did what you wanted him to do. So I was thinking in my head, what's the problem? Well, I think many of you probably are aware of the transitions families go through when someone stops drinking in their family. And I mean, there's a fair amount of research on the amount of depression that goes on in families where someone becomes sober. So I am scratching my head and thinking, what in the world is going on here? And then I happened to go to a National Council the National Council of Alcoholism conference, and there sat Dr. Bowen on a panel, and he starts talking about the family. And I said to him, well, you know, how do you work with the family when someone is is addicted. And he sort of goes, he used to go like this, which means that is not a question I will answer. So then I got intrigued, and I got interested in and began the training program at what was then the Georgetown Family Center, and what has evolved into the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family in Washington, D.C. So what I came to understand is that, just in that first interview, is that family life is not as simple as you think, that there is a complexity and a depth that, that I sought to understand better. Now, one of the questions I want to ask you is, how many of you are familiar with Bowen? Let me go back. With Bowen? Okay, I just went and took a picture under the Bowen room there. I was like, I can't believe this. Now I've got to show this back in Washington. Because I can talk a little bit. What I want to leave you with tonight is this idea that the family is a system. And you can say, well, that's a pretty easy concept to integrate. But I think I worked in the alcohol and drug program part-time for 23 years. I saw hundreds of families. And I will say that's one of the hardest things to keep in mind. It's a simple idea that's hard to keep in mind. And you can take a lifetime of looking at someone who has a symptom and losing the family focus. So if there's anything I want to convey tonight, it is the family is an emotional unit and a system. I'm happy to talk about addiction. I think it is one symptom a family has. It's a terrifying symptom. It is extremely destructive in a family, but I think it is a natural part of the emotional process of a family, and that is part of what allowed me to stay in that center for all those years, because I didn't feel responsible for the problem. I could see it as part of the emotional process in the family. So that's the kernel that I'm trying to leave you with tonight. And I will talk about this. So these are my goals. This is a definition of addiction, which I think probably all of you have seen. I think it's an accurate description, behavioral description. Now, one of the things I want to talk about, which I have actually added to this presentation, is that alcohol and drug addiction are related to the opioid receptors in the brain. Probably all of you are aware of that. And if, one of the therapies is to block those opioid receptors so that someone who takes heroin, for instance, doesn't have a response. However, so there is this neurological basis for addiction that's based in the way that the brain has developed in the human over time, over the millennia. Okay, so the individual model of addiction, it would be taking the opioid receptors and thinking about it as a problem there in the brain, a problem in the individual in the brain. The individual model is addiction is a disease. It is biologically based and genetically transmitted. It is a pathology of the individual, and it should be diagnosed and treated. And that would mean that when you conceptualize addiction, you're talking about an individual who has a problem called addiction that was defined in the first slide. But this is just research that's been done that I think is consistent with Bowen theory, that the opioid receptors are essential to regulating the physiology, emotions, and relationships of the human. They're not just related to drugs and alcohol. So these are the things that the opioid receptors regulate. And I'm not going to read them all, but it involves complex behavioral and emotional regulation of the human. Here's some more. I mean, it's the immune response, it's the way the gastrointestinal system works, it is about sexuality, and it is also about the regulation of relationships. So, for instance, concretely, the opioid receptors are regulating the interaction between the mother and her baby. That is going on. And the pleasurable sensations that mother has in seeing the baby or breastfeeding the baby, that is being regulated in the brain in the same way that addiction is integrated into those receptors. So this is Jaak Panksepp, and he is a professor at Eastern Washington State in the United States, and he wrote Effective Neuroscience. And what he talks about, and I'm just going to give you a little glimpse of this, is that the neurobiology of addiction is related to social dependency. Now, I could see that in the families that I saw, that it isn't the most independent and self-reliant person usually in the family that becomes addicted. It is the one who is most sensitive and dependent on the way the other family members are functioning. So what he says is, I'm going to read this because I think it's an important foundation for this talk. One reason certain people become addicted to external opiates, he is including alcohol, is because they are able to artificially induce feelings of gratification, similar to that normally achieved by socially induced release of endogenous opioids, such as endorphins and enkephalins. In doing this, individuals are able to pharmacologically induce the positive feeling of connectiveness that others derive from social interactions. So, just to summarize, that this becomes a substitute for feelings of secure attachment and connectedness. And this is a schematic talking about how he relates drug dependence to social bonding, drug tolerance to estrangement. Is there any way we could turn this floating thing off? No. Okay. So he correlates these two, the opioid addiction and the social dependency in this way. And what I can do, if you want, is I can provide these slides for you. So, because as I said, 2 hours is not very long to do this, and I want to hear from you. So this is Murray. So I want to transfer over. So that is the sort of the research on the neurological connection between addiction and social connectiveness. And this is where I think Murray Bowen belongs. He talks about the family. Apparently most of you know about him. He was a psychiatrist. He began his work at NIH in the 1950s, where he studied families of schizophrenics. He began to conceptualize. He was a psychoanalyst who began to observe that with families of schizophrenics and Meningers in Topeka, Kansas, that when a family member would visit, the symptoms would become more acute in the schizophrenic. And he began to wonder, as I did, but he created a theory, what was going on in the relationship system that would affect the person with the symptoms, and began to construct a theory about that, which I think you have heard something about. So what I'm going to try to cover, just briefly, is the family as an emotional system, the idea of differentiation and the scale of differentiation, symptom development as a family adaptation, and that I think is something I'm going to sort of concentrate on, and a little bit about triangles in the projection process and emotional patterns that manage anxiety. So that will be about 20 minutes. So we'll see how far we get here. Okay, so what I was talking about before is the family as an emotional unit. And there are a whole range, and I know you teach a variety of different ideas about families, family therapy here. There are a variety of ideas which encompass family therapy. And I think there was a report that I've done several talks about this, that was put out in the 1970s called the GAP Report, and it summarized family therapy at that time. And they talked about the A therapist and the Z therapists. And the A therapists were therapists who sort of saw the individual and the family as sort of a reaction to the individual problem. And then you had the Z therapist who saw the problem or the symptom as part of the way the family was regulating its emotional process. There were the A therapists and the Z therapists, and then there were some that did a little of both. And Bowen is a Z therapist. He sees the symptom as part of the way the family is regulating its emotions around the stressors it faces and the level of anxiety in the family. So the family is interacting in reciprocal patterns. And one of the things that Bowen conceptualized is that symptoms could be emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms, or physiological symptoms. So he would put an affair, a migraine headache, and addiction in the same basket. That it would be that these symptoms could reflect the level of anxiety in the family and the capacity or incapacity of the family to handle that. So he says the symptom of excessive drinking occurs when family anxiety is high. And then the process of drinking is to relieve anxiety. And then there's increased family anxiety in relation to that's a fairly typical idea in the area of substance abuse, that it becomes a spiral of a problem, a reaction to the problem, more anxiety, more reaction, and it becomes a chronic pattern. Okay, so I'm going to go into Bowen theory now. This relates just to the general ideas of Bowen. And what he says is that there is a balance in the forces for individuality and togetherness in the human. So that each of us has a need to be autonomous and separate and have our own lives. I mean, if we don't have that, we are probably schizophrenic. We have to have some level of individuality. But the human is also a social creature. We have always been social. Since the Neanderthals, we have the necessity to collaborate and be a part of a social group. The most essential of that group would be the family, but then you have the tribe, the village, the other social groups that are in our more complex society. So these forces are at work, one for self, the other to adapt to the unit of which we are a part. So he says the one force is for togetherness, is for the universal need for emotional closeness, love, and approval. And the other is for individuality, powered by the drive to be a productive, autonomous individual, as determined by self rather than the dictates of the group. So that's a basic idea in Bowen theory. And this is a summary of that. He also talks about emotion. He sort of condenses emotions into a basic human responsiveness, which he calls anxiety. And it can be registered at the emotional level, at the physiological level, or at the behavioral level over time and across generations. And one of the things, I'm not going to talk about I know that Colleen was talking about Bowen theory as the multi-generational theory. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight, although it's very, very relevant to alcoholism and drug addiction, which I'm sure you're aware that it's very often a process that's transmitted across generations. But when he talks about the level of anxiety, he talks about it's kind of like the sea a child swims in, that the family has a certain level of reactiveness to one another, a certain level of emotional, how can I say it? Emotionality, I guess is the word I would use, that can be transmitted from one generation to the next. So that if the mother is anxious, or the father and the mother, that can be projected onto the child, and the child can end up being anxious. So often, we would have children in the center I worked with ADHD or behavior problems. Well, that was probably not unusual when mom and dad were yelling last night and having a big fuss. But so that anxiety is a pattern responsiveness that goes over time and across generations. This is my effort. Let me go back. Okay, it's transmitted through family relationships over generations and is triggered by life events and can become generalized. And there's so much more I could say about that, about the multi-generational part of it. But when anxiety is high, the ability to think, plan, evaluate, and decide is compromised. That is, the capacity to manage self is compromised when anxiety is high. So do many of you work in the field of alcohol and drug addiction? Okay. So an example would be, I have many, many examples, but you have someone who's been sober 25 years, and their wife dies, and they drink. Or where I worked, we had a psychiatrist who worked with the Navy, the American Navy, and he, in the substance abuse center, in the substance abuse area of the Navy, and he moonlighted for our program. And he said that when naval personnel who had an alcohol problem retired, they didn't get their 24th paycheck. That is, that when these Navy people who had a drinking problem retired, they no longer had the structure that managed them, their anxiety. And at the end of 2 years, they were dead. That was one of the observations that they made. So that, there's many ways that anxiety can be triggered. But this is actually true for all of us. That we can do very well, and then on a day we're anxious about something, we lose it. That is that we have less capacity to think and to manage the emotionality of our lives. So Bowen makes, I'm doing this in leaps and bounds here, but he makes a tie between individuality and togetherness, that is the capacity to be a self and the capacity to be thoughtful. And he's saying that if a person is concerned about what other people think or what one needs to do for someone else, or one is dependent on others, that is a reflection of the level of emotionality in that individual. Does that make any sense, or should I say that differently? And the less capacity that person has to really chart a life course. I mean, we all have problems. The question is, in what way are we capable of thoughtfully working out how to manage them and problem solve? And when emotionality is too high, that just flees. You know, in our family therapy program, we do coaching, you know, and so some of the trainees come and they go, well, I am going to talk, this is my plan about how I'm going to talk to my mother. And so then they come back. So they make a plan, or, you know, this could be a client. So they make a plan. They come back and they said, you know, by the time I hit the city limit, I had forgotten my plan. You know, and that would be an example of how emotionality can wipe away our thinking. And this is a basic idea about, I think the working side of Bowen theory is people can know very often what they need to do. Like mothers who hit their children know they need to be calm. They know that. They just can't manage the emotionality. People, I mean, I used to see dozens and dozens of families with teenagers with substance abuse problems. You know, you'd get the teenager in there, they would be crystal clear that they had a problem. I mean, they didn't want to do anything about it, but they knew they had a problem. They just did not have the capacity to manage themselves to solve the problem.